Hello, and welcome to Will's Infinite Library. I'm Will, and this is my Infinite Library. So, I read a lot in February, and I thought about how I wanted to present this video, and I think I just want to talk about the fiction books that I read because that's kind of the focus of this channel and of what I usually read. But I also read a lot of literary fiction, some fantasy, some sci-fi, some mixtures of all of those things. I read some nonfiction. I read a science book and a writing craft book, and I read 3 books of poetry. So I'm keeping up the momentum of reading a lot, and I don't want to talk as much about that kind of stuff in this video. I want to just focus on the books and get right into them. And then at the end, I will talk a bit more about kind of my overall reading journey through the year and where I think it's taking me, or where it has taken me so far at least. But let's just get right into the books because that's why we're all here. The first book I read in February was Station 11. I'd heard so much about this book, and Sea of Tranquility was really like kind of at the forefront of books from 2022. But I really wanted to read Station 11 first. So I read that, and like kind of what excited me about it was this idea that it follows this traveling symphony through kind of like this post-apocalyptic world. And so it's kind of like this theme of what is the purpose of art and how can it help us as kind of a survival thing when survival is first and foremost on our minds because the world is ending. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to stay alive. What is the importance of art in this kind of environment? So I found that idea really compelling, and it is kind of brought up at some points in the book. The traveling symphony travels in a kind of caravan, and they have this text on, they have this big banner that says traveling symphony, and on it says, because survival is insufficient. And I found that really compelling and interesting because it got at that kind of theme that I was hoping the book would. But it wasn't really a central theme of the book, I felt, and that turned out to be a Star Trek quote, which no shade against that. Like, I love Star Trek. It has a lot of cool ideas I really enjoy, especially The Next Generation. Great show. But it wasn't really the heart of this book. And it started off feeling more literary, which surprised me because I was expecting more of like a commercial genre feel to it. But it felt very literary at the opening, and I was really enjoying that and the like kind of different structure of not focusing on the pandemic itself, but focusing on what happened before the pandemic and then what happened after, like 20 years later, I think is where it kind of picks up in the post-apocalypse world. So I really enjoyed that, kind of different feel to it. But as it went on, it began to feel like it was focusing more on that post-apocalyptic piece of it. And it just had kind of a non-traditional structure, which made it feel more literary, which was kind of a weird component. It just felt like kind of a genre fiction novel that kind of went against the grain of what's kind of normally done in that space. And it's focusing on that post-apocalyptic world. In my mind, that's how I kind of read it, with kind of flashbacks from the before times, breaking up it a lot. Which was a bit hard to get into at times. And as it went on, I got more and more into it, got more invested in the characters, seeing how they all related. But the other thing is, I heard like this book is about a pandemic, but it's not really about a pandemic. It's about the before and the after. So it's not as kind of triggering as you might think a pandemic book would be in these pandemic times. But as it went on, it focused more on like the plot line of what happens after and then what happens before. And the before line goes from like it's starting to happen to like it's happening. And it got very heavy for me in those moments, and it got really triggering, and I did not enjoy those parts. It was very uncomfortable and felt like too close to reality in some like weird kind of like, this was written well before the pandemic, I think 2014. And it was just, yeah, it was just too real for me. It was too soon. So if you're thinking about reading this book soon and you haven't already, just keep that in mind that like a lot of people say it's not too soon and probably isn't. But for me personally, it was, and we all respond to these things differently. So if you feel like it might be too soon to read a pandemic book, maybe don't read this one just yet. In the end, I'm glad I read it, but it was just too soon for me. Which brings me to the next book I read, which was Sea of Tranquility. I think I actually read a nonfiction science book between it because I needed to break it up. But the next fiction book I read was Sea of Tranquility because I wanted to take a break, but I wanted to then dive into Emily St. Mandel's next work that was like a all buzzing all around BookTube and the world in 2022. I really wanted to see how it kind of followed Station 11 as a pandemic book. It felt very epic in scope, following multiple characters throughout history from history through like present and the near future. But overall, the book was really short and it delved into a lot of interesting themes again, like Station 11 kind of touched on these themes. But in this case, it was more like kind of the nature of reality and are we living in a simulation and these kind of things. And like what is real, I think was really what she was trying to get at. But the book was so short. I think it was too short to really explore those kind of ideas in any kind of like deeper, more meaningful way. My cat just almost fell from his cat tree.
He's trying to go out the window.
And one of the storylines takes place in the past and was about a character like coming over to Canada from England, and I found that story really interesting. It was kind of about how like there was this time in history when if you're not, and actually through a lot of history, when if you're not like the firstborn son inheriting everything, you have to kind of go out and make a life for yourself where that's not really kind of the norm of society. So I found that really interesting to see all these like second and third born children out in Canada making a life for themselves, starting farms and this kind of thing. And then one of the kind of focuses was an author who wrote a pandemic novel during a pandemic and is going on a book tour during a pandemic. And that was kind of, I think, a central story, although they all kind of interweaved. But I just say that because I watched an interview with the author and she was talking about how that was kind of the impetus for the book, was an author on a book tour, because she had had a crazy experience with Station 11 promoting it and just made her see writing and her career in a different way, and she wanted to kind of explore that. And then she later decided to add in all these other layers to that story. So I think that was kind of at the heart of how it started, at least, which makes a lot of sense thinking back to the book, and everything else was kind of complementing that story. But overall, yeah, I felt like there were a lot of interesting ideas, again, like Station 11, but it just didn't give them space to breathe and to fully get explored. So I enjoy Emily St. Mandel's writing a lot, and I'm cautiously optimistic to see what she comes up with next, because I think she has a lot of really cool ideas. And I don't think she wants to be a pandemic writer, but with all the focus these two books have gotten, I don't know how I'm going to be able to see her another way. I want to, though, but I think it's going to be hard for her to break away from that. So I'm really curious to see what she comes up with next. The next book I read was another literary novel, also from 2014, I believe, which is kind of weird. Yeah, these two books were both from 2014. Station 11 and A Safe Girl to Love by Casey Plett was the next book. So this is a short story collection that came out in 2014 originally. And since then, she's had a lot of success with her fiction. A Dream of a Woman was longlisted for some awards, and then her novel Little Fish also won, I think, several awards. And so Casey Plett's becoming a more kind of prominent name in Canadian literature. But I think some people probably missed her first book, and it's not really in print anymore, or it wasn't until now. So her first short story collection is back in print, and it's really nice. I really enjoyed it a lot. The pieces kind of ranged from more traditional stories to kind of more experimental pieces that were in the format of lists and things that were like more fun. There was even like a speech kind of transcription. And there's one story that's kind of surreal and weird and involves a talking cat. But like all of these stories focus on the lives of trans women who are kind of navigating the world and their relationships with cisgendered people and other trans people, and just trying to figure out their lives, like all of us. And there's a lot of heart in these stories, and they're really beautiful, and they can get painful, but I think they really do a good job of being holistic. So you never feel like it's just like heavy or it's just like sugarcoating everything. It feels like a really good full picture of all of these characters, which I think is one of the strengths of her writing. Yeah, they just really bring the characters to life, and it was a nice kind of breath of fresh air to read. I don't know, good old literary fiction again after reading some kind of things that were blurring the lines of genre and not 100% succeeding all the time. It was nice to just read some more straightforward fiction. Overall, I'd say that I described it as kind of holistic, but like bittersweet would probably be like if I had to wrap up all of those feelings at once. It is kind of like almost tragic comedic her work in that it presents all sides and feels really fleshed out. So yeah, that's A Safe Girl to Love, a really nice collection. The next book that I read was, again, I wanted to kind of break things up and bounce between genres. The next book I read was The Mysteries of Thorn Manor, which is a young adult fantasy novella, which follows up on Sorcery of Thorns, which I read last month to try to get back into YA fantasy. And Mystery of Thorn Manor is just kind of like a lighthearted, it feels like a filler episode. It's a short novella that follows a standalone YA fantasy, and it's all kind of vibes and fun and lighthearted and about like getting ready for this ball and following the characters after their main story. So it was fun and enjoyable, and I think it scratched that itch for YA fantasy that I hadn't read in a long time, and I think I'm kind of good with it for a while. Like I think I don't need to read much more in that kind of vein for a while. So then I moved on to sci-fi. Back to sci-fi, my latest obsession. So I reread Rabbits, which I talked about in a previous video. I kind of skimmed before because I was really interested in the ideas and wanted to see what happened. But at the time, I wasn't really reading as much for pleasure. I was still kind of in that mindset of like, see what all the books are about, like absorb them for research for my own writing and see what's out there and just like get through all the books and absorb everything. And like kind of this mindset I was in from grad school of just learning to skim and get through fast with the key points. But this time I wanted to kind of like slow down because I knew that I liked the book before, but I didn't take the time to really enjoy it on a page by page level. So I was in the mood for it now. I went back to it and I really got into it. And my thoughts are kind of similar on it. I do still think that like it's this alternate reality game that's like, is it a game or is it something more? It's a fun kind of mystery with these deeper sci-fi implications. And as I was reading it, I realized that this is kind of like my favorite kind of pleasure read, which is what I've been kind of searching for the past few months in my reading, is to figure out what do I really want? Like when I was a kid, I feel like I'm chasing the high of Animorphs was like one of the series I loved so much as a kid before I really got deep into video games. And it was also a sci-fi kind of adventure series. And I just had to always read the next book. Goosebumps 2 was another one that I just devoured. And so this book kind of like hit a lot of the same notes of feeling like this big adventure. There's more to the world than we know. And like it's about following this mystery and this conspiracy to unveil the secrets of the world. And I realized that's kind of like my jam and what I'm chasing when I want to find the next book that I just devour. So that was a really good experience. I don't want to say too much about it because anything is a spoiler, and the mystery is like what really drives this book. I will say if you enjoyed books like Ready Player One, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, Foucault's Pendulum, even The Matrix, you'll enjoy Rabbits. And the less you know about it going in, the more you'll enjoy it, because some parts you'd probably just want to skim over because you'll already be familiar with. But if you don't know much of anything, you really enjoy it. The other thing I want to say is the main character is named Kay, and this is something that I didn't really grasp the first time I read it, or didn't think about it. I knew the name was Kay, but the part I didn't realize was that they're not gendered at all in the story. They're kind of a silent protagonist, and it feels like the main character in a video game or something, where you're meant to kind of like layer yourself on top of them. So Kay has like a decent backstory that sets up the story and the plot and drives things, but their gender is never identified. And I think you're meant to insert yourself, and it almost becomes like a first person perspective of the story. They feel more male in a lot of ways to me. Like the first time I read the story, I read it as male and didn't even question it, just because of the language and like all of the kind of like coded interactions between characters. But I've heard canonically it's Kay is female, because the narrator of the audiobook is female. And I don't know, I don't think we're really supposed to know or care about their gender. We're just supposed to absorb ourselves in the story, and that's kind of the point. And there's also a lot about kind of like secrecy, so the more the character can keep close to their chest, the better in terms of telling the story. So it kind of works on a lot of levels, and it was just interesting that as I reread it, I kept in mind, we don't really know this character's gender. Maybe they're non-binary, maybe it doesn't matter, and I kind of like that it doesn't matter. It's kind of refreshing. And so overall, like, I would say I really enjoyed this book. It's not necessarily like a top tier like favorite book, but it's really in the vein of books that I enjoy, and it didn't quite reach the tier of like Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore for me, because it's much darker, and that's another thing that I really absorbed on a second read. The tone is really heavy and dark and dire, whereas like Mr. Penumbra's bookstore felt kind of more magical to me, and like made me kind of excited about the mysteries of the universe, and this one was made me curious about them, but in kind of a heavy way. And so the last book I want to talk about today that I read in February was Armada, which is another sci-fi book. I bounced off this book several times in the past, but finally got through it and enjoyed it. And it had a lot of links back to rabbits, in that there were alternate reality games talked about again. That wasn't like the focus, but games were, and sci-fi conspiracies were, which scratched that kind of itch again of like, there's this bigger mystery to the world, and then everything that we think we know isn't true. So I really liked that. Oh, my other cat is now looking around for trouble. So if you hear a meow, that's probably what that is. Probably. I say probably. So anyway, Armada is basically a story about like what if space shooter video games were not just video games, but were real, kind of like The Last Starfighter. And it's by the same author as Ready Player One, and comes with all the trappings you would expect of that. That it really does harken back to like really 80s sci-fi pop culture and that kind of era. And it is kind of like oversaturated with geek culture references, to the point that you really have to suspend your disbelief that everyone in the future is intimately familiar with 80s pop culture, and like have designed, I don't want to spoil too much, but like have designed things that they use in the real world around things from 80s movies and video games. And that like random people who are like young, like teenagers, know references to 80s songs and things. Like, it felt like a bit of a stretch, so I just kept like stepping back and saying, okay, just like let it go. And that's the other thing, is that this is the softest sci-fi I've read in a while. So I had to keep telling myself, like, suspend your disbelief. Don't worry about it. Like, it's not supposed to be accurate. It's just supposed to be a fun, lighthearted story. And it does really feel like a big dumb blockbuster full of spectacle and all of the good and bad that comes with that. And also that comes with that is a bit of kind of like toxic masculinity, which isn't exactly what it is, but like it feels kind of like that. Like, there are a lot of things that had me rolling my eyes, like throwaway details about the characters' major flaw being like that he has anger issues, which is like so cool and tough. Like it felt weird. One of the characters from outside the US, one of the only characters from outside the US is Chinese, and he speaks zero English, so he speaks through a translator, and he can't say anything in English, like not even thank you. That gets translated. But the main character can flawlessly repeat Chinese after this character says a phrase in Chinese one time. So it's just kind of like this, I think, like very American dude bro, I don't know, mentality of the protagonist that is feels very blockbustery and all the things that come with that. So yeah, it reminded me a lot of books that I read as a kid as well, pre getting into video games, which was interesting. And yet I found another book about games. So those are the books that I read in February. I read a lot more this month than last month, even, which I did not expect. I also played some video games too, so I don't know how I managed to find all this time, but I did. And I read such a wide variety of books that I think they always felt fresh and exciting. There was always something I was curious to read next. And I picked up something else when I wasn't in the mood for what I was reading at the time, so I didn't really burn out. I kept that momentum going. And I think a lot of what's made me be able to replace games with books and read as much as this is that I've been kind of transferring my obsessive habits for video games to books. So like I would try to play through a game to get to the next one, to play all the games in this series or play all the games by this developer or this creator or whatever. And with books, I started making this list of like sci-fi and fantasy books and literary books that I wanted to read and checking them off as I read them. And it scratched that kind of itch of like being well read or whatever, even though I'll never read all the books that I want to or feel like I should read. And I realized that like if I'm just checking things off lists to check things off lists, it doesn't really matter if they're games or books. And I don't know where that leaves me. But I ended up deleting my TBR list because I don't want to feel like I have to rush to get through a book to get to the next one. And I want to read what I feel like reading at the time, whatever I come across that feels like the next book for me. And just, I don't want to just read things to get through a list. I like that kind of idea of the book finding you when it's the right time and you finding the book when it's the right time. And that's, I feel like that's been happening to me, but I've been pushing through them to get to the next one. And I've slowed down my reading a lot and really kind of savored books more recently and kind of gained that skill again of reading for pure entertainment and escapism that I had when I was younger before video games kind of took over that part of me. But I think that I do still feel like, oh, I got to get through this book, you know? So I want to kind of shake that a little bit. I think it's going to be really hard, but that's kind of my next goal. And I honestly don't know how long I'll keep up this pace of reading as many books as I am. I think it's going to drop off at some point, but who knows? The only thing I've really realized is that reading books, even to get through a list, I never feel like I wasted my time with them, even if I didn't enjoy them or love them. I feel like, okay, I know what that book's about. I get it now, and like there's something satisfying with that. Whereas with a video game, even if I enjoy it, there will be like a boss fight that I can't get through, and I beat my head against the wall and spend like a day trying to beat it. And I feel like I wasted so much time by the end of that. Whereas books, I never feel like that. So I just think that's interesting and something that I'm going to keep in mind as I decide how to spend my free time between books and video games and what I do with it. And I think that means that I want to focus more my video game time more on social games that I play with other people, because that never feels like wasted time. And my reading time more on the right book at the right time and enjoying that and reading different things when I just can't get into fiction, reading a book of poetry, reading a single poem, reading a nonfiction book. And I've really enjoyed reading nonfiction again, specifically science, because that kind of reminded me of another thing that I've loved about books over the years is they are just so full of ideas. I mean, you know, I don't have to tell you this, but I feel like I need to tell myself this, so I'm saying it out loud. And like reading a nonfiction book reminded me how exciting it can be to read a book and just, I don't know, just devour the ideas inside of it and to read it to gain knowledge rather than to get through a story or to even finish a book and hop. And I feel more like I can hop around through different topics and chapters in nonfiction too, which is kind of nice and like getting the information you want out of it. So anyway, that's a long-winded update on what I read in February. I have no idea what's coming for March, so stay tuned. But I'd love to hear, like, what are your favorite kind of comfort reads? What is your favorite escapist entertainment? What are the books that you just devour, like Animorphs and Goosebumps? I'm gonna make this into a saying. What do you devour like Animorphs and Goosebumps? Let me know your favorites, what you've been enjoying lately, if you've had kind of similar struggles that I have, or just what your reading journey's been like. I would love to hear from you. Anyway, that's it for this month. Thank you again for hanging out with me. Again, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Drop me a message. And with that, I'll let you get back to your reading. And I will see you next time.